Hello, everyone, and welcome to McGill Cares webcast series supporting family and informal caregivers. I'm Claire Webster, a former caregiver, certified dementia care consultant, and founder of McGill University's Dementia Education Program. I work with a dynamic team of leading healthcare professionals to oversee the program, who include Dr. José Moret from the Division of Geriatric Medicine and Dr. Serge Gauthier, Professor Emeritus, formerly of the McGill University Research Center for Studies in Aging. McGill Cares is supported by the Amelia Saputo Community Outreach for Dementia Care. Today, we have a very interesting topic, which is nutrition and dementia. My guest is Guylaine Ferland. Professor Ferland is a professor of nutrition at Université de Montréal and a scientist at the Research Center for the Montreal Heart Institute. Professor Ferland conducts research on the general role of nutrition in cognitive health during aging. She is an expert in vitamin K metabolism, and her team has made a significant contribution to understanding the role of this nutrient in brain function and cognition. She recently contributed an excellent essay on nutritional interventions for the 2022 World Alzheimer's Report. Professor Ferland, welcome to McGill Cares.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this series. I'm really happy to be here today. So today, indeed, what I will be presenting is the nutritional situation of people living with dementia, and we will discuss some of the challenges that we are faced with as the disease progresses. The first thing that we want to say about nutrition and brain function is that the brain relies on a constant supply of energy and nutrients in order to function optimally. And so we have the macronutrients, which are the proteins, the fats, and carbohydrates, which provide this energy. And we have the micronutrients, which consist in the vitamins, the minerals, and the antioxidants, and they work together to support brain health. For instance, they may be involved in the structure of the brain cells, such as the myelin sheath, or they can also be involved in the synthesis of neurotransmitters, which enable cells to communicate amongst themselves. One very important thing to say is that no one single nutrient or food will do magic. I mean, there's not such a thing as a magic bullet when it comes to memory and memory impairment. And we have to keep this in mind all the time. So another thing that is very important to say is that the energy and nutrient requirements of people living with dementia are no different than for the rest of the older population. That's why we don't have a specific diet for people living with dementia. We just have to provide them with a well-balanced, nutritious diet. One thing we need to say, though, is that individuals living with dementia are at high risk of weight loss and malnutrition. And we will come to this a little later. But in essence, the diets that are good for the brain are those that are rich in fruits and vegetables, that contain whole grains, that contain low-fat dairies and lean proteins, and that are more limited in foods that are high in saturated or trans fats, added sugars, and salt. So diet patterns such as those which are proposed in Canada's Food Guide, the Mediterranean Diet, the Brain Health Food Guide, which I'm going to introduce a little later, and the Mind Diet, these diet patterns are all good for the brain. And probably one of the reasons is because they are also good for the rest of the body, and they reduce risk for cardiovascular disease and diabetes, for instance. And these are known to be risk factors for cognitive impairment as we age. So here you will probably recognize the latest version of Canada's food guide, which was revised in January of 2019. It was released in early 2019. And essentially, it was developed for the whole Canadian population. And this applies to also to individuals living with dementia. And essentially what it proposes to do is to fill half of our plate with fruits and vegetables. And here we can say the greater the variety, the greater the number of colors, the better. A quarter of our plate should be filled with protein-rich foods, and the protein can come from animals, from meat, from poultry, from dairies, and also from plants, so from legumes, for instance. And 1/4 of our plate, to finalize the whole plate, should be filled with whole grains. So whether it's whole grain bread, brown rice, oats, quinoa, barley. So essentially, this is the kind of plate that we should aim for on a daily basis. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the Brain Health Food Guide, which is a tool that was developed by the team that I lead in the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration in Aging. And it is a tool that is largely based on the Mediterranean diet, but which also includes a specific recommendation for the brain. Now, this tool is available, and if there's an interest for it, I will be very happy to provide a link for it. It's a compact tool. It's a two-pager, as we say, and it is available in both English and French. It's very easy to use. Now, planning healthy meals can sometimes be challenging, and I would like here with the next two slides, I would like to provide some tips which you may consider when planning your meals. For instance, it's always good to keep stock of convenient foods such as frozen fruits and vegetables, because they are virtually just as nutritious as the fresh versions. We can have pre-cut salads, canned fish, beans, nuts, and nut butters, for instance. We should always look for products without added sugar and salt. There is already, when we buy, especially canned manufactured products, there's always sugar and salt added. So if we should try and avoid we should aim actually for the label of no salt or sugar added, and this usually is easy to find on the label. As I mentioned earlier, we should look for the term 100% whole grain when we buy our breads, our cereals, our pastas and crackers, because those are, from a nutrition point of view, they are more healthy. We should also be mindful when we purchase the fats that we use when for cooking. For instance, extra virgin oil and canola oil are very good oils for cooking. When we purchase our fat or the dairies, we should look for the versions that are lower in fat. So we're talking about the milk, the yogurt, the cheese. We should also aim to plan meals around fish, poultry, and also plan meals that do not contain meat, perhaps once or twice a week. This, of course, in place of meals that contain red meat. We should also keep in mind that there's a wide range of ways in which we can add legumes, and we can to our meals. For instance, lentils, chickpeas, and beans can be added to soups, to stews, salads and dips. So it's really a question of imagination and of initiatives on our part. There are actually a number of cookbooks that also provide nice recipes. I would now like to turn to malnutrition in the context of dementia. I did mention that it was common, and I would like now to address some of the factors that may contribute to that. So in the early stages of the disease, individuals may have difficulty shopping and cooking. They may lack the motivation to cook and eat. There may be appetite changes, a decrease in appetite, which will decrease the food intake. There may be some changes in taste and smell, and actually the loss of smell is much more common than the loss of taste, and it is well documented in Alzheimer's disease, for instance. And when we lose a sense of smell, we actually lose our capacity to appreciate our foods. We just have to think when we have a serious cold where our nose is totally blocked. We simply have difficulty recognizing the food that we eat. And so the loss of smell is something that is fairly common. And one easy way to know if the person we care for is affected is simply to ask them to offer a rose or lilac flower or whatever, and ask them if they smell what the flower actually. And so it's an easy way to know if people still have this sense of smell. In contrast, some people may develop some cravings, for instance, for sweets. And this can be problematic in the sense that it will displace nutritious foods if there is a focus on one kind of food. And there is also the question of depression. In the early stages, people are often depressed, and actually depression is, irrespective of the context, is an important risk factors for malnutrition. Now, as the disease progresses, people may no longer be able to recognize and communicate their hunger and their thirst. There also may be some behavioral problems during the meals, such as confusion, agitation, anxiety, and aggressivity, which, of course, will impede with the meal experience. Some individuals may become hyperactive. We all know about pacing and wandering, and some people can cover kilometers in one day. And when this happens, of course, the energy needs will increase as a result of a greater energy expenditure. So if these needs are not met, well, of course, this may lead eventually to weight loss. People, in contrast, may become weaker and lose motor skills, which, of course, will be a problem when it comes to feeding. As the disease progresses, in the very last stages of the disease, people may no longer be able to recognize the food. They will not be able to dissociate the edible from the non-edible items, and we have to be careful about that to avoid choking. If a non-edible item has been swallowed. And linked to this, it is not uncommon to see people with dysphagia. And dysphagia is when we have difficulty swallowing. And this is not a benign condition, as it is often associated with aspiration pneumonia, which can actually a serious condition, and which needs to be definitely prevented. So actually, we often end up in a situation of where there's a vicious circle where we have cognitive decline, or people with cognitive impairment that who may have decreased food intake. This decreased food intake will lead to malnutrition, and malnutrition, as we mentioned earlier, can contribute to the progression of the disease. So it is very important that we are vigilant to detect states of malnutrition, because if we let this circle continue, the situation will only get worse. So how do we recognize malnutrition? So, of course, this is an extremely simple slide, just give you the main elements. And these are signs that are well recognized in clinical practice. On top of the list is weight loss. People who are malnourished oftentimes will have lost weight. So this is why it is important to monitor the weight on a regular basis. And I would like to add in the same conditions, ideally same time of the day, and in the same clothing conditions. And if the person wears shoes, always during weighing, always use the same shoes, and if no shoes, always no shoes, so as to limit the introduction of confounding factors. People who are malnourished oftentimes are weak and are less energetic. They lack energy. And so weakness, decreased energy are signs, easy signs that we can see when if we suspect a condition of malnutrition. Malnutrition is also associated with frequent infections and increased recovery time. So if repeatedly the individual develops infection on a regular basis, this is not a good sign. And we may suspect malnutrition at that point. And as we mentioned also, malnutrition will contribute to the progression of the disease. So if we see that the individual from a cognitive and behavioral point of view has deteriorated, it may also be a reason for we may suspect malnutrition. Now, I would like to turn to the question of hydration and the lack of, because this is just as important as food, in fact. We sometimes forget that dehydration is a major risk factor for confusion and delirium. And but we can add to this the fact that dehydration increases fatigue. It contributes to a delay in wound healing, increase the risk of falls and urinary tract infection, and it is a major cause of constipation. Now, why do we develop the dehydration? Is not specific to people living with dementia. It is a phenomenon that is being observed through aging, and the reason for this is that older individuals lose the sensation for thirst. They are not they do not react the same way as younger adults, and they are also less sensitive to low fluid volume. Now, Fluid requirements at the moment are quite well known. Older adults should consume at least 6 to 8 cups of fluid daily. This amounts to roughly 1.5 to 2 liters. And by fluid, we're meaning not only meaning water of course, but other fluids such as milk, tea, juices, and soups. And we also must keep in mind that some foods are high in fluid. For instance, melon, grapes, cucumbers. These are really high. They have a high fluid content. So there are ways that we can hydrate ourselves. There are actually different ways in which we can hydrate ourselves. So some tips here again to help increase fluid intake. We can aim to include a beverage with each meal and snacks. We can offer small amounts throughout the day. For instance, leave water bottles or glasses in accessible places where people can reach out to them easily. We can also vary the temperature of the fluid. Some people prefer cold, and depending on the season too, we may want to have in the summer during the heat waves, we may want colder beverages, and in contrast, in the winter, the warmer beverages. So it's basically a matter of playing with this and really adapting the beverages to the preference of the individuals, and as I said, perhaps the season too. Just keep in mind that we can flavor water with fruit slices such as lemon or lime or herbs, and some people also like carbonated water. So these are good options. And finally, some people prefer to drink their fluids with straws. So this should be, that's an easy way to meet this need. The bottles should always be, of course, easy to open, and there are also for people perhaps with tremor, and we will talk about this a little later. There are a variety of dishware that can be used in order to facilitate the intake of fluids and also of food. So it is very important to hydration is important, and we especially in the hot in the summer when we have hot temperatures, it is really, we have to be mindful of always have beverages available throughout the day in order to avoid the condition of dehydration. Now, I'd like to say a word about supplements. Current guidelines do not recommend single nutrients, and usually we're talking about vitamins or minerals, as a standard of care in the context of dementia or cognitive impairment, unless there is a documented nutrient deficiency. If someone is deficient, we find out that after a blood work, someone is deficient in vitamin B12 or other vitamin, then of course supplementation is required and should be implemented. But when it comes to, and as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to cognition, to memory, there's absolutely no evidence. The research has not provided compelling evidence that nutrient supplementation can correct cognitive impairment or prevent cognitive decline. Believe me, if there was such a nutrient, we would know about it, and we would all be taking it on a daily basis. We have to keep in mind that foods contain a variety of nutrients that work together And this cannot necessarily, I mean, this simply cannot be replicated in a supplement. This is why our plate is probably our and what we put on our plate is our greatest ally. But as we mentioned, some people have a diminished appetite, and because of that, they cannot necessarily meet their nutrient requirements on a daily basis. So for these individuals, we can. There are the oral nutrition products. Some are presented on this picture, which that we can rely on. They usually provide about a third of a daily's need for the micronutrients. And so they can be used either to supplement the meal or they can be used as snacks. Research has shown that they have proven beneficial to maintain weight. So, you know, it's they are available. They don't need prescription for them. They're easy access, and they can help in maintaining nutritional status. Now, if you have concerns about whether the person you care for just meets their requirement, you can always consult the registered dietitians. They are really the health professionals with the expertise to provide counsel on these issues, and they're easy. There's the Ordre des diététistes et nutritionnistes du Québec, but there's also there's also the Canadian Dietitians of Canada, which are of course available, and they provide names and resources, names of registered dietitians that eventually can be consulted. Now, I would like to use the rest of this presentation to discuss ways in which we can support individuals living with dementia in eating as best as they can. And the underlying principle is that we want these individuals to be as independent as possible and for as long as possible. So everything we can do to have them eat by themselves, the better it is. So the first thing that we may want to consider is the meal planning and organization. It is helpful to plan and shop for meals in advance, as it provides a structure within which we can work. We, of course, always have to keep in mind the food preferences and cultural tradition of the person that we care for. And also some of the medical conditions, such as diabetes or bowel disease, which can be impacted by the diet. So we have to be mindful of the big picture, so to speak. It might be useful to write and print out the meals, the ingredients, and the cooking instructions. Just having this in print on a table, easily available, can help. Keeping the ingredients well organized and easily accessible in the kitchen, so that people don't have to look for them. It may be useful to label cupboards and drawers simply to facilitate the finding of what is needed to prepare the meals. And it is important to regularly go through the refrigerator and the cupboard to dispose of spoiled or expired foods. This, of course, to reduce the risk of food poisoning or, conditions, situations of similar to that. Another component is the meal schedule. It is useful to set some kind of a routine, regular meals. So have the meals, if this is what works best for the person, whether it's 3 meals per day, whether it's 5 meals per day. It's good to always have to establish a routine, just again to provide the structure, a greater structure. Research has shown that when family members and caregivers are present at mealtime, it definitely helps. It increases the meal experience, and it is definitely helpful. Now, there are people, especially in the early stages of the disease, who live alone. And for these individuals who have lost their sense of hunger, for instance, or who have become forgetful, we can think of setting an alarm clock and a signaling device as a reminder that yes, this is the time to eat, and we should sit down at the table or prepare whatever meal or snack that we had planned for that time of the day. It is also important to pay attention to the eating environment. Again, there's some research studies that have shown that calm and peaceful environment are conducive to positive meal experiences. And we should avoid as much as possible the distractions and the loud noises. For instance, television screens or computer screens, because as we have seen earlier, people oftentimes there's confusion. So if there's distractions during the meal, this will only accentuate the problem. And in fact, I've read some studies where they have tested the impact of relaxing and familiar music. And this turned out to be, again, positive towards the meal experience. We should also aim for simple plates, placemats, and tablecloths in contrasting colors, just to help the individual distinguish the food from the placemat or from the table, and to help them locate the food, because as we saw, as the disease progresses, people will have difficulty distinguishing the food, finding the food. So you have an example here of a setting, of a table setting, and we should always keep utensils that are needed for the meal. So again, we go for simplicity, and just to help our parent or whoever the person we care for be able to eat that the meal experience be as fluent and as pleasant as possible. Now, we talked about poor appetite. This is a reality, and so here are a few tips that we may consider if we suspect. When we're faced with poor appetite, this is something that people will tell us, and simply when we eat with them, if they simply don't eat, if they only eat a fraction of their plate, we know that their appetite is affected. So we should check that this is not caused by medication. Sometimes there are changes in medication or changes in the dose of the medication, and we know that some drugs can have an impact on appetite. We should encourage physical activity when we want to increase appetite. We know that a walk in fresh air will open appetite. This will This works for even when we're younger. So this is something, if it is possible and if it is within the range of the reality of the individual, this is something we can propose. For people with taste and smell impairments, we can try strongly flavored and aromatic foods. We can use herbs and spices. We should always cater to individual taste, preference, and offer choices. It's important. It's part of eating. Is a joy every day. It should be a joy every day, numerous times a day. So it's important that we love, that we like the food that we eat. Encourage eating with others. There's been some research done on this issue, and it has been there's quite solid data showing that people with poor appetite, when they are placed in a context where there are other people people that they like who eat with them, will eat more. So this is something to encourage. We can try smaller, more frequent meals and snacks. I did mention that earlier, because sometimes the big meals can be a bit overwhelming. So smaller, more frequent meals are usually more successful in increasing daily energy and nutrient intake. And of course, if we're faced with someone with poor appetite, it is all the more important that the foods that are being consumed are nutrient dense, that they are high in calories and protein. Now, there are people with motor impairment. So for these individuals, what can be envisaged is to serve the food in bowls rather than in plates. We suggest to use non-slip mats or wet cloths under the dishes to prevent slipping. They are, as I mentioned, there are there's dishware that can be obtained. There are companies that can be reached on the web, but elsewhere too. So that we have access to cups with lids and utensils which are large and easy to use, as we've seen in the previous picture. And we can also, as I said at the beginning, we want people to be as independent as possible. So we have to think about finger foods like sandwiches and cut up fruit and vegetables, fish sticks. So the idea is really to maintain independence as much as possible. And finally, for people with chewing and swallowing issues, the first thing that we should have in mind is to consult a dentist, and just to make sure that that tooth and gum issues are not the cause of the difficulty in chewing. The speech and language pathologists are the healthcare experts when we want counsel on textures, food textures, and eating strategies, and they are really the go-to professionals if we want counsel on that on this topic. We can also suggest or prepare easy to eat foods, foods that are chopped or shredded, mashed or pureed, although the pureed is usually considered only as a last resort, because it's more difficult to be inventful with a pureed food, although there are possibilities now. We can also add broth, gravy, and sauces to soften and moisten the foods, just to help them to facilitate the swallowing. And if we live or if we care for someone with swallowing issues, it might be a good thing to to get to learn first aid, to get a training in first aid in the case of choking. So I come to the end of my presentation. I leave you with a few resources that you may want to consult. The DREAM project is an initiative from colleagues at the University of Waterloo, and they provide all kinds of useful information with regard to diet, but also to physical activity. And there's also, of course, the Alzheimer's Society of Canada, which always have up-to-date information. So this is another resources that can be consulted. And finally, I would like to thank Ms. Fatim Ajwani, a registered dietitian and dear colleague, for helping me putting this presentation together. Thank you.
Professor Ferland, your presentation was so amazing. It just brought back my journey with my mother, and so many things that you described I had lived through. Like, for example, some of the things you mentioned in the early stages, my mother was living alone. And I think a lot of people don't realize the correlation between how one's appetite nutrition changes with dementia. And, I would go and visit her, and there was all this expired food in the fridge, and she was constantly eating the same meal over and over again. So she used to buy these little frozen food lasagnas, and every day that's all she ate. And I realized afterwards it's because she just did not know how to prepare her own meals afterwards, right?
Yeah.
And some of the clients that I work with, I remember going in to visit their homes, and just also, bread that had become molded, or, dry goods that had become, really, that had turned over time.
Yes, yes. Indeed, I mean, this is a reality, and it's we can't blame the people. Of course, it's just forgetfulness, and there's they are no longer necessarily aware of all the importance of these issues. So I think that it's there are relative, of course, when people living with dementia have family or caregivers, these people usually are, they're attuned to this. They are aware that these aspects should be verified, and they're fairly simple. It's just a matter of setting a routine and making sure that on a regular basis, we go through the fridge, or and we just make sure that that people are not eating spoiled food, because of course this can cause problems.
I also, when you discuss the later stages, and this was, at this point also my mother had been placed in a long-term care residence. But when a lot of people start noticing that my mother was no longer able to use utensils, she started using her hands, and the risk of choking, when I work with families, is very real. That inability to judge, when you're cutting a piece of steak or chicken, how big to cut it, or how many chews it takes to swallow. And I remember one Christmas I had arrived with a box of Laura Secord chocolate, and some of the pieces were actually larger, and my mother put the whole thing in her mouth, and I actually had to take my fingers and pull it out because she could have choked. So she was no longer able to understand how many bites it took to swallow.
Indeed, and this, this again, this is a reality. There's some, and this is why we really have to be very vigilant, and also to make sure that the mouth oral health is impeccable. And if people are wearing dentures or whatnot, just to make sure that they are able to chew, and in residences or in geriatric institutes, there will be the caregivers will encourage people. But of course, the point that you just made about the size of the bites, this, we have to be aware of that for the people, because they may not they may not have this judgment of how much they can. There's a reflex when it comes to swallowing. There's a reflex, but what goes into the mouth is has to be judged and has to be monitored closely, just to avoid the situations that you are mentioning.
So I have one last question. Because you brought it up, and it does come up over and over again, is when people who have dementia, all of a sudden they start eating more sweets, right? Somebody who may not have even ever had a sweet tooth, just all they want to eat is cookies or chocolate. Could you explain that?
Well, we don't really know why. There's some, there is some people. For some people, it's the case, and for others, it's not necessarily the case. We don't have an explanation for it. I mean, it's in contrast to the loss of smell, where I think it's quite clear that it's the loss of cells in the olfactory bulb. With respect to the sweet, it's we just see it, and people just crave for sweet, and of course we don't want to deny people their sweets, but we have to be careful though that they have a well-balanced meal otherwise, because if not, we have seen this vicious circle and what it can lead to. So but unfortunately I'm afraid we don't have an explanation for that at this time.
Well, I'm going to make sure to create the link for your brain health food guide we have a section at mcgill.ca/dementia called Trusted Resources. And we will definitely have the link to your brain health food guide, which looks very, very, very informative and educational. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, I really feel that this webcast should be watched by many healthcare professionals who are also working in long-term care, because it is so important to make sure that people living with dementia are properly fed, and it's a question of really putting a lot of effort and having patience, and it's so important. So thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Claire. Thank you.
This webcast is an initiative of the McGill Dementia Education Program, which is funded by private donations. If you would like to make a contribution to our program or for more information, please visit our website at mcgill.ca/dementia. And if you would like to join our mailing list to be notified about upcoming episodes of McGill Cares, as well as other important programs and resources from our program, please visit us. Please send us an email at dementia@mcgill.ca. Thank you for watching.